So first and foremost, my name is Kadeen Cummins. I'm a CMCCF board member, and I'm here to get this show on the road by doing the intros, welcome, and get the ball rolling. So tonight we're here to dive into the heart of diversity, an exploration of Canadian census data by exploring Canada's diversity statistics and the Vanier Institute of Families Diversity Framework Cultural Community Lived Experiences. So that's a big reason why we're here. So this is the first of a two-part dynamic two-part series exploring the 2021 Canadian census data and to hear from cultural community members about their lived experiences. Our second one is on March 21st, 2023, regarding the Family Diversity Framework. So I hope all who are here will mark it on their calendar. We promise it will be a good one. So that's March 21st, 2023. Our hope is that these two dialogues will serve to raise awareness, two, from community members to reflect upon their own lived experiences, and suggest ways in which we can all act in a, act and work together to create a more inclusive and supportive environment for all people. So those are the three reasons. Our foundational belief is that in working together, we can contribute to a healthy families and healthy communities for all. All ongoing CMCCF initiatives are grounded in a partnership framework. And the key objective the coalition aims to achieve through these initiatives, is to enhance diversity, objective, enhance diversity, equity and inclusion structures and within the community setting, Ultimately, we see the outcome of these initiative or this initiative will be to achieve our outcome of strengthening families and community well-being, which is aligned with our vision of healthy communities and healthy families. We acknowledge and thank Canadian Heritage for their financial support of this new initiative, also our ongoing support from the Winnipeg Foundation. Tonight's panel is being held virtually and will provide an opportunity for many cultural communities and allies to learn more about the data behind diversity, inclusion, and equity from a cultural community perspective. Soon, I will hand over to our moderator for tonight, which is Louise Simbamdue from Immigration Matters in Canada Coalition. Also, this is a hybrid event. So thanks to technology, we're all scattered. So the panel is here at Mediation Services in downtown Winnipeg. Our physical host in their training room across Zoom, and the audience is on Zoom too, some in Winnipeg, throughout Manitoba and other areas across Canada. And I think Alka is in India, if my memory serves me right. So I will add across the world. I will run through a few technical considerations for tonight. So first and foremost, I'll ask for everyone who's present to please type your name, organization, or community that you represent tonight. So if you could put that in the chat function, because we want to know who is sharing the experience with us tonight. So I'm not going to repeat myself. Name, the organization or the cultural community that you do represent, and your email address in the chat function, please. So I'll give you a minute so you can get that rolling. Thank you, Louise, for putting what I'm asking. So name, organization, or community that you do represent, and also your email address. And while you work on that, I'll just continue, but if you could just keep doing that till we have everybody present there. So this event is being recorded, and if you would not like to appear on the recording, then please turn off your cameras. For those who do not want to show as attending this event, we'll go ahead and ask you to disconnect at this point in time. But before you do, I'll tell you why we're recording this event. The recording will be edited, and some of it will be used in public settings such as our website, and content from it can appear on our social media. And it's just so we are sharing all the good work that we're doing and the information coming out so others can experience from a distance what we're doing, right? So that is the reason why. But if you're not comfortable, we'll ask you to disconnect at this point. Thank you. So as I mentioned, some of us are here in Winnipeg in Manitoba, and CMCCF is located on the original land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in a partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So at this point in time, I'll introduce the moderator, Louise. As I mentioned, Louise is a member of Immigration Matters in Canada Coalition and a grassroots community activist. A former refugee, Louise is passionate about human rights and social justice. Her volunteer commitments include the Immigration Partnership Winnipeg Council. She's co-director at SEED Winnipeg and the Police Accountability Coalition. She's a busy lady, I tell you. She also served on the advisory committee for Manitoba's Poverty Reduction Strategy and the Ministerial Advisory Committee for Canada's first Poverty Reduction Strategy. So I'll repeat that. She also serves on the Advisory Committee for Manitoba's Poverty Reduction Strategy and the Ministerial Advisory Committee for Canada's first Poverty Reduction Strategy. Louise has a bachelor's in commerce from the University of Saskatchewan and a master's in comparative social research from Oxford University. She has developed and taught innovative courses on financial empowerment, community economic development, and human rights advocacy at the University of Winnipeg. So at this point in time, I'd like to hand over to Louise. You're welcome.
And helping to establish the context for tonight. I would also like to thank the Coalition of Manitoba Cultural Communities for Families for organizing this important event. Before we start, I'll run through some guidelines for tonight's panel and discussion. So the first, which can be a challenge for some of us, is to try to keep your comments fairly brief. This is a good reminder for me because often I'll press send on a chat message and realize, oh no, it's a partial message or there's grammatical errors. But just check your chat message before you send it just to make sure that it accurately reflects what you want to communicate. We would appreciate your assistance in helping to move the discussion along by adding to what other people have said. And we also invite you to share your own experiences and reflections with others. Please respect others' opinions, and I'd also encourage you to share affirming comments and appreciation, as these are an important part of building community. We will be monitoring the chat, and if you have other questions and comments that you wish us to bring forward, please use this process so that we can hear your voices if time permits. We have a pretty jam-packed agenda today, but we definitely want to invite you into the conversation. So we have three really remarkable panelists and a respondent who will provide closing reflections on our evening together. So the structure for the evening is it'll open with an overview presentation from Catherine Spence from Statistics Canada. Kathleen Duran and Erica Frey from Immigration Partnership Winnipeg will each have about 10 minutes to respond to the presentation. This will be followed by a question and answer period between the panelists, and then you will have your opportunity, members of the audience, to pose your questions or make comments. And then each panelist will also have an opportunity to make some final comments. And then Sanjan Panag from the University of Winnipeg will then offer her reflections on what we just heard. So we're going to move into the presentation. We are really pleased that we have a representative from Statistics Canada to provide an overview. StatsCan has a pivotal role to play in measuring and sharing data that broadens our understanding of how cultural communities and families are doing in Canada. They've launched a gender diversity and inclusion statistics hub that community members can access online. Catherine Spence will be providing us with an overview of the diversity in Manitoba from the most recent census data and how our communities are changing. Catherine is the chief of the Census Program in Diversity and Sociocultural Statistics at Statistics Canada. She is the chief of the Census Program in Diversity. Catherine joined Statistics Canada in 2006 and has worked on the census since 2011. So there's a real depth of experience there in the subject matter of immigration, ethnocultural diversity, religion, and languages. So I'll turn it over to Catherine.
Thank you, and I'm really pleased to be here, and glad that you included us in this discussion, and excited to share the data that we have at Statistics Canada. So I'm going to share my screen and just get right into it. I'll be presenting some of the results that we have. We have several census releases that just came out in the last year, and this was the sixth release of the census on the immigration, ethnocultural diversity in Canada, and I'll provide some insights on Manitoba as well. Sorry about that. Seems like the slideshow only wants to work on side. Okay, so first I'm going to start with the total number of immigrants in Canada. Canada has a long history of immigration. Millions of people from all over the world have chosen and continue to choose Canada as their new home. In the 2021 census has recorded over 1.3 million new immigrants who came to and settled permanently in Canada from 2016 to 2021. This is a census record number, despite fewer immigrants being admitted in 2020 because of the border and travel restrictions implemented in response to the pandemic. When combined with those already established in Canada, more than 8.3 million people, or almost 1/4 of the population, were or have ever been a landed immigrant or permanent resident in Canada. This was the largest proportion since Confederation, topping the previous record from 1921, and the highest among the G7. Given that Canadian population continues to age and fertility is, on to the next one, sorry. This one's getting used to the Zoom one, there we go. Okay, on this one, close to 2/3 of the recent immigrants are of core working age, which is helping to rejuvenate Canada's aging population. While immigration ultimately cannot stop the population aging process, the recent immigrants have a rejuvenating effect on the Canadian population overall. Since people usually migrate when they are young, the vast majority of recent immigrants to Canada from 2016 to 2021 were just under 65 years of age. Just over 1 in 10 were youth aged 15 to 24, and almost 2/3 were in the core working age group, 25 to 54. Now let's take a look at Manitoba. Immigrants represent almost 20% of Manitoba's population, the fourth largest share in all of the provinces. This is after Ontario, BC, and Alberta. There were over 250,000 immigrants living in Manitoba in 2021. The immigrant population in the province grew by 13.3% between 2016 and 2021. 3.1% of all immigrants in Canada now live in Manitoba. In Canada, immigrants are selected according to three broad objectives: to enhance and promote economic development, to reunite families, and to fulfill the country's international obligations and uphold its humanitarian tradition. Over 70% of recent immigrants living in Manitoba were economic immigrants. Provincial nominees were the largest class of these recent economic immigrants. For the total immigrants who have arrived since 1980, over two-thirds of immigrants who arrived in Manitoba were economic immigrants. Given the increase in the number of temporary foreign workers and international students, as well as the expansion of some economic immigrant programs, for example, the Canadian Experience class and the Provincial Nominee Program, two-step immigration is more common among recent immigrants, which means that they were in Canada as a temporary resident prior to becoming a permanent resident. In 2021, more than one quarter of the new immigrants who reside in Manitoba and who had settled permanently from 2016 to 2021 had gone through the two-step immigration process. This compares with 11.8% among longer-term immigrants, those who were admitted between 2001 and 2005. Based on previous studies, there are many benefits associated with pre-admission experience. It plays a key role in lifting immigrants' wages as it provides pathways for immigrants to acquire language skills and knowledge of the Canadian labor market. New immigrants often settle in regions where they have existing social networks, economic and employment opportunities, and enjoy the general appeal of the area. Several immigration programs and investments were also designed to help balance the geographical distribution of recent immigrants across the country and encourage settlement in both small and large metropolitan areas. As you see by this map, the Atlantic provinces welcomed a higher share of recent immigrants in Canada than the previous census, while Manitoba and other prairie provinces saw their shares decrease. Manitoba saw its highest share of recent immigrants in the 2016 census. The places of birth of immigrants to Canada have changed over time, in tandem with changing immigration policies as well as international events. Asia, including the Middle East, remained the continent of birth for most recent immigrants in Manitoba for the 2021 census. Like Canada, overall, India was the leading country of birth for recent immigration to Manitoba. It was followed by the Philippines and Nigeria. In contrast, in Manitoba, the share of recent immigrants from Europe continues to decline, falling from 61.4% in 1971 to 7.5% in 2021. And sort of in this graph, you can see from 1971 all the way to 2021. And this graph here shows you the top 5 places of birth of recent immigrants. These changes in the places of birth in immigrants over time contribute to the linguistic, ethnocultural, and religious landscape of Canada. You can see that many recent immigrants speak most often at home in languages in addition or other than English or French. Punjabi, Tagalog, and Mandarin are listed as the top 3 in the table above. The vast majority of recent immigrants living in Manitoba reported knowing English, about at 92.6%. Canada's diversity landscape continues to evolve. Data presented today reflect how Canadians see ourselves. The information will help to better understand who we are as a country and is important for policy and program development that aims to foster an inclusive society. In this next section, I will highlight the key findings from the census on ethnic or cultural diversity, namely ethnic or cultural origin, racialized groups, and religious groups. Canada has a longstanding and ongoing widespread demand for information on the ethnocultural diversity of the population. The origins reported by respondents are subjective in nature and multidimensional, reflecting the image Canadians have of ourselves, as well as the knowledge and understanding of our family's ethnic and cultural heritage at a given moment. Changes were made to the 2021 census question on ethnic or cultural origin to better reflect the changing and complex nature of the diversity of the country. As a result, Statistics Canada is publishing data on more than 450 ethnic or cultural origins as reported in the 2021 census. In 2021, Canadian was the top origin reported alone or with other origins. Nearly 1 in 6 people, or 5.7 million persons in Canada, reported this origin. Origins from the British Isles were the next most common, in particular English, Scottish, and Irish. French was ranked fifth among origins most often reported. French Canadian was also on the list most frequently reported origins. German, Italian, Ukrainian, Chinese, and Indian were also each reported by at least 1 million people in Canada. The ethnocultural portrait differs across the country and every province and territory. Canadian, English, Irish, Scottish, and French are among the origins most often reported, alone or with other origins. Aside from this constant factor, many other ethnic origins stand out in the various regions of the country. For example, in Manitoba, we also see German, Ukrainian, Filipino, Métis, and Polish are among the frequently reported ethnic origins. Another longstanding and ongoing need for diversity data is on religious affiliation. This information has been collected every 10 years since 1871. In 2021, over a third of Manitobans reported having no religious affiliation, up from 26.5% in 2011. This is among provinces and territories, after Yukon, BC, Alberta, the Northwest Territories, and Nova Scotia. In 2021, just over half in Manitoba's population was affiliated with a Christian religion, down from 07 and 10 in 2011. The percentage of the population reporting affiliation with a non-Christian religion increased from 5.1% to 9%. Muslim, Hindu, or Sikh represent small but growing populations in Canada and in Manitoba. The proportion of Manitoban population who reported being Muslim, Hindu, or Sikh has more than doubled in 20 years. Almost a quarter of the population in Manitoba is part of the racialized population. The most common racialized groups reported were Filipino, South Asian, and Black, which together make up of the total population of the 16.2% of the total population of the province. The racialized population of Manitoba as a whole grew considerably since the last census. The fastest growing population between 2016 and 2021 were South Asian, Arab, and Black. Each racialized group are diversified in many respects by place of birth, languages, religion, ethnic or cultural origins, and this may be part of our discussion a little bit later in terms of, intersectionality crossing different variables together. For example, 1 in 4 Filipinos in Manitoba are born in Canada, with the majority being born in Manitoba. So of those that were born in Canada, the majority that are living in Manitoba right now were born here. For Filipinos born outside of Canada, their main country of birth was the Philippines. The vast majority of Filipinos reported Filipino as an ethnic or cultural origin. Other commonly reported origins by Filipinos included Spanish, Chinese, and Canadian. As another example, the majority of the 71,000 South Asians in Manitoba were born in South Asia, including India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, while 19.1% were born in Canada and 1.1% in Africa. Now you can take these populations by place of birth and cross it by ethnic or cultural origin, by languages to really get a really full and diverse picture of each of these populations. Just to give a taste of the regional highlights, Canada's urban centres are home to the vast majority of the racialized population. But the portrait of the racialized population group varies across the regions and across the country, and even across Manitoba as well. The Filipino, South Asian, and Black groups are the largest racialized groups in Manitoba, as you can see on the map. In Manitoba, 88.8% of the racialized population live in Winnipeg. 3.7% in Brandon, and 1% in Steinbach. In this presentation here, this gives an idea of all the different and various products that we have available on our website for free at Statistics Canada that you can use to look at the diversity of specific populations. It goes right down to the community level, very low levels of geography with 450 ethnic or cultural origins. We have more than 450 languages that we also have collected in the census as well, by detailed place of birth, by detailed admission category. So you can really drill down with the census data to get at these really small populations at the community level. And that concludes my presentation.
Really appreciated both the care you took in terms of focusing on Manitoba and giving us a sense of both point in time data as well as a sense of some of the overarching trends that we're seeing. So we're going to turn to our panel to comment on what they've just heard. So very pleased to introduce Kathleen Erica. So Kathleen Viran came to Canada at the age of 4, reading from Georgetown, Guyana with her family. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Human Rights and Global Studies from the University of Winnipeg and began her career working with newcomer, immigrant, and refugee communities over 10 years ago. Kathleen has worked in varying capacities from frontline service delivery and to administration and management within the sector, currently residing as a project manager at Immigration Partnership Winnipeg and with the Ethnocultural Council of Manitoba Stronger Together. Her area of focus is K-12 education, community-based research, and youth initiatives. And our paths have crossed many, many times. You wear many, many hats, and you do it all amazingly. Erica Frey has over 11 years of experience as a community development, settlement, and immigration professional. She is a project manager also at Immigration Partnership Winnipeg and coordinates the employment and civic engagement sector tables. And I know she's incredibly passionate about that work. Prior to this, she worked for 7 years supporting and walking alongside newcomer women and their families, as well as with gender diverse folks. Erica is committed to continuous learning, reflecting, and building connections with the Indigenous peoples of this land we call Canada. And I know she's a passionate advocate when it comes to issues related to gender, to newcomer integration, and you and I are working together on a project with the city right now, an advocacy project, and just has a wealth of knowledge, but also just a real heart for this work. So I'm going to turn it over to both of you, starting with Kathleen, to reflect on what you've just heard and make some comments.
Yeah, sure. I'll keep my comments brief, just be mindful of time. But thank you so much for that presentation. And I think it's reflective of how diverse our communities are here in Canada, and specifically here in Manitoba. And I think this data for us allows us to see how our work, for those of us that work in settlement and within this sector, is so relevant and is so needed, because we're bringing so many newcomers with such vast amount of skills, language, knowledge to settle here in Manitoba. And the work that we do with these communities to ensure that their settlement journeys are as seamless as possible, and that they can be as successful as possible. It just shows the need for our work. So I think that, and also the need for things like government to invest into the work that we're doing. So stats and data like this help us in being able to advocate for things like those funding, and things like the programs that we need to have to develop, for those of us that have worked frontline and know when we have families or we have parents or we have youth that come to us and say that they need these services or this isn't being met. It's data like this that's able to help us show that the need for the work that we're doing.
Thank you.
I think I think that is super important, and I think lots of these points I've been making notes and sort of reflecting on some of these portals and following some of the releases from Stats Canada in the last little while, as we do try to do advocacy here in the city of Winnipeg, talking about creating a policy of inclusion in our city. And I think sometimes this information really help us make the case for policymakers and for politicians of why our communities are relevant. Why should they modify their services or programs to respond to the city that they should be working for? And I think having tangible examples of how not just how diverse communities are, but also how complex are. I think that and then how different people have different migration journeys towards Canada, and are we providing offering services in the public and all of our community levels that are catering to all? Because I think this point around talking about the two-step immigration system, I think oftentimes lots of the funding comes when you become a permanent resident, and lots of programs around that, which is great. But I think this really highlights that there's a gap in Manitoba, and why is it important that folks are here prior to that with different experiences, via being an international student or on a work permit, or they might be an asylum seeker, so they are already living in this city, working in this city, contributing to the fabric of our society. But having statistics like that prove that there's been a growth, there's a large percentage of people, a quarter who are in these communities, and are we providing services for them? Are we bringing their realities into all of these spaces? So I think that's one area that I will say that's where stats are very, very helpful. And to just bring more to light also within our own communities, to see I'm Peruvian, so I try to think about in my own ethnocultural community, how are these families are representing in these statistics. And I can think about people that have actual stories that can embedded in that, and how we also need to reflect on that. And and the last piece that I'm going to say is it's very important to talk about racialized communities too, and the data is showing that if we're not community agencies, ethnocultural communities, and policymakers and politicians need to be really thinking about how are we planning and how are we building our community responses for the reality of that by 2041, 2 in 5 people are part of racialized communities, and how in cities like Winnipeg, that's 88% or something. So it's a very, if there needs to, this stat will help us make the case of why we need specific policies, why we need anti-racism training for public servants. This is a fact, and if cities or organizations are not preparing with that lens, then we're ignoring a very important part of our population. So I think these statistics really help our cases.
Well, thank you both very much for those thoughtful comments. When we were chatting a little bit earlier, you mentioned that you wish you'd actually had your hands on some of this data when you were presenting at City Hall this morning on the Newcomer Welcoming Inclusion Strategy. So I'm just wondering if both of you could elaborate on that point about how this data is relevant to the work that you're doing right now in the community.
And so for right now, so I work with the Ethnocultural Council of Manitoba, and the ECCM is over 40 ethnocultural community groups that have come together to address gaps and barriers within each of their communities. And one of the things that we see very often is when we're talking about, the policy or the settlement journey of those newcomers, the reliance on ethnocultural communities to help in their settlement journey. And I think it was mentioned that people tend to settle somewhere where they have connection. So if there's a family member, if there's a relative, if there is a community that they know is well established, that's where they will choose to settle. And I think ECCM specifically has done so much work to help those newcomers that are coming to be able to have their settlement journey and find their roots here. And oftentimes they take on networks because agencies may not be able to because they're not funded. Because sometimes we have very archaic systems that do not allow or do not understand how much need is there. So seeing data like this allows us to, again, have that argument that the work that these ethnocultural communities are doing, lots of times they're doing it out of the kindness of their heart. They're not doing it for payment.
No.
They're doing it to ensure that that community member is getting the needs met and that they will not fail when they come here. And I think that that work often goes overlooked. So many times, I think, again, within our systems where they attach a dollar amount, that dollar amount is minuscule compared to the amount of work that is actually being done. So when I see numbers like, 1 in 4, with 1 person out of every 4 that's in this room right now, and I look at it, I think those of us, that belong maybe to a racialized community or belong to a different ethnocultural community, like there's so much history and there's so much knowledge there. So I just think that, again, that work often goes overlooked and our systems don't often match the amount of work that's being done. So I think stats like this help. However, I think we all just need to be listening a little bit to it. So
yeah, no, that's a really great point. I can't remember who coined the phrase, if it was me or at ERCOM, but referring to ethnocultural communities almost as a shadow settlement sector, where they're doing all of this work that seems that isn't necessarily that visible and almost taken for granted.
Yeah, sometimes I do think that it's like an expectation that it's just going to get somebody else will pick up the slack somewhere else.
Yeah.
And it will, but it's unfair, right?
Yeah.
So I think that we need our systems to match, the work that's actually being done and appreciate it that way.
And I think there's a parallel between that and the way in which labor is also gender and the way in which women's labor is often invisible as well. And I think often that work is also being done. Yeah. So Erica, you're nodding a lot, but did you also want to respond to that question about how this data is relevant to your work in the community?
Yes, and I think I might say something about the labor part in a little bit.
I love that.
But because there is something on Stats Canada that is very interesting. But currently, to my current work, I think, so I coordinate the civic engagement and inclusion sector table, and as you said, Luis, we're collaborating on doing some policy work, advocacy, currently at the City of Winnipeg to implement this newcomer welcome and inclusion policy that was co-created as a community effort within many sector members and many community organizers and led with Immigration Partnership Winnipeg. And this policy is great, but it was approved on February 2020, and since then there has been not actually investment into the implementation of it. And I think statistics like this really help us try to make the case with politicians, with people who might not be connected to the work or might not make the dots of connection between why, for example, like this is one of the pillars of this strategy talks about anti-racism and ending racism in our city and recognizing, and I think the points of intersectionality, but also that some of these things are embedded in the system. And I think there's fear talking about those kind of things, but when we talk about doing what people are racialized, if we are not training our public servants on anti-racism, how are we making the city safe and inclusive? So I think having data that can point to this, to these points really strengthens some of the argument. I mean, not all elected politicians may think so, but I think it's good to keep bringing back the message, and this really helps us. So I think policy work advocacy is super helpful to have this data relevant to enhance our point that we see in the community members may experience. Also, I think for program planning, because sometimes if you're doing day-to-day community work and then you're like, oh, I have this great idea about what's going to be working for newcomer women, let's say, put myself as an example. You might be thinking about it, but you don't have all of you might then read a study around immigrant women in the labor market and all of the barriers, and then you're like, okay, this is connecting to potentially this program, or if you're designing it, you might modify it by additional information you have not seen, let's say, about the intersecting identities of folks who come from the Philippines. And maybe if you're planning a specific program, I think data could also be helpful in that piece. Yes, and then the other pieces, we do a lot of work on our sector table around employment, and I think oftentimes there's a huge case around the economic migrant and the economic contributions of immigrants. So having data that back that up is very important, but also data that talks about women's full-time employment. And Stats Canada, as part of I think the daily thing that they do, they had one very good one that was called Unmasking Differences in Women's Full-Time Employment. And what it caught part of my eye is that there's a specific there's the experiences of women in general in Canada, and that there's still an existing pervasive wage gap. But then it talks about examples of, for example, with immigrant women, depending how long we've been in the country, it might be actually more difficult if we have been educated, post-secondary education outside of Canada, how much more difficult is for in credential recognition for us as women who are carrying lots of other roles, if we of caregivers often, of communities, of people in our families, how much longer it might take for immigrant women who are internationally educated to even enter the labor market or stay in the labor market full time. And that is a stat that comes from Stats Canada that may represent something that we've been seeing in our communities. And then we can articulate what it is. And the other piece of like this statistics of like immigrant women with partners are less likely than to be full-time in the labor market when we first arrive, and often comes around different things in a relationship, or if the partner is the one studying or working, sometimes there's not an equal distribution of caregiving, and could be also an access to childcare, which is a systemic issue, right? So I think having these type of statistics really help to drill into the experiences in the labor market. So when we talk about employment, then we can have more of those conversations. Okay, I'll stop. So
No, that's fantastic. So, like both of you have articulated in different ways how the lived experience of the communities that you're working with, like how this data is validating what you're seeing, maybe also deepening your understanding of what is being experienced by the community. So we'd just like to invite you to reflect further on that in terms of how these findings impact the lived experience of individuals in cultural communities, particularly in relation to inclusion and gender identity. And I'll add another piece to it, which is around accessibility. So do you think this data is accessible to community members?
Then jumping, yeah, I think. Louise, that's a good one.
A little bit of a curveball.
Yeah, no, it's good. I think accessibility is so interesting because lots of folks might not know that this even exists, right? Like they might know that if I go to the diversity portal, when I first look at the page, it's like, okay, yeah, I can identify some of the topics, but so I think that's one point, that maybe more dissemination, like the conversation we're having today, is needed in different communities, and also making the points of connection of how the data is relevant. Some of the tools that Stats Canada have that are helpful, I think, and I've seen it on social media, But not lots of people follow Stats Canada on Instagram. But but it's some of the infographics are really good. Like they have good imaging, clear statistics. Again, I look a lot about gender and stuff, so that's my thing that I'm always paying attention. But I think that's a good tool, like in the how they present the infographics in social media, in which Stats Canada could continue the work of disseminating some of this information. But sometimes we might need more spaces of conversation where we can actually have folks to see, yeah, that reflects my lived experience of actually this is way far off, that we don't think anyone in our community can connect with this. So I think definitely for it to be accessible, more folks need to be known about that this exists, and then also to think about how is the information like the data is accessible to understand, not like a long report that, like, if I'm not a stats expert or numbers, I might feel overwhelmed with how exactly use the portal. But in an infographic, I can get really pointed information that may connect to the work in my community or my own lived experience.
So the infographics assist with that translation exercise where people are having to manipulate the tables and try to drill down to the data that you're looking for. Yeah, no, that's great. Did you want to add any comments?
Honestly, I think I agree with everything that you're saying. I think like even prior to this panel, I was like, I don't know if I could speak to it. Like, I don't know if I know enough, or I don't know if I have been able to understand, the stats enough on my own to be able to speak to this. So I can only imagine being a community member, maybe just trying to navigate that. But I do agree with what Erica is saying in terms of how that data is presented to our communities is what will help disseminate it. So whether it be through conversations, whether it be through the agencies or the settlement services that they're seeking, are they presenting that data in any way? How are they able to understand it? Are they using it even as well in their quests for funding? So so I agree with everything that Eric is saying in terms of the way that this. I think we have to be creative in the way that we present it to our community members.
And when you mention quest for funding, you're referring to the ethnocultural associations in particular?
Yeah, because I don't know if they would go and pick out this data from this if we as an agency or an organization didn't provide them with that, if they would know to go to the Stats Canada website or how to navigate the hub or the portal and be able to use that. Like, I don't know if necessarily they would be able to.
And maybe Catherine, are you with us? I wonder if you wanted to make any comments about the efforts that Stats Canada is making to make this data more broadly accessible.
Well, I'm glad that you like the infographics. We do have a great social media team at StatsCan, and I think that's sort of the idea behind them, is to make that a little bit more relatable and digestible for people. Because, I mean, obviously, I'm presenting a lot of data today, and there's some graphs and stuff, which is great, but that might not be necessarily able for a lot of people who don't use data a lot. And even if I were to show you the website and where we have all the census data, there's stuff where we have some visualizations, which I think help make the information more digestible. But if you're going to go to a big table with 450 ethnical cultural origins, that's a lot for someone to look at. It's just a lot of numbers, right? So I agree that in order to kind of reach out to maybe those that are not as data savvy, that we have to put it in a way that they can relate to a bit better. But we are, always open to, any feedback from anyone in terms of the way we disseminate information, how we can make it more user-friendly. We actually are in a phase where we're starting to do consultations around our dissemination. So it's on our website. People can click on it and give us feedback on how we disseminate our information. But we try to reach a variety of users, right? Like, so we have really people who just want to take the whole database and do their own maps and visualizations, and they're really data savvy, and those that are just want to use the sort of snippets from the infographics, or those that want more of an analytical piece, or there's the daily that we publish every day as well to release data. So we try to reach a variety of users that way, but we really do want to give back to the communities, and they took the time to fill out the census, and now we have all this data, and it's great to see how people are using it. But we also would like to get back to all these communities that have taken the time to give us their information. So
Catherine, what would your long-term plans be in terms of the kind of data that you would like to collect beyond what you're currently collecting, and also your long-term plans around dissemination?
well, right now we just released the census up until the end of November with all the sort of big releases. So usually the long-term plans around that is we start to release even more detailed information than what we have. And what I mean by that is it's crossing more topics together, so we can get more information on, labor market outcomes and education, and like all the variables that are within the census, so you can get a little bit more information on some of those economic outcomes for the different population groups. So we do try to create, there'll be more in the fall where we'll be creating more what we consider to be almost special interest profiles, so you can select a specific population group and see various characteristics for those populations. A lot of the stuff we have on the census is very geographical based, so it's really great if you want to get a snapshot of your community and see what that looks like. So it goes down to a really low level of geography in that sense. And then we try to put out simpler analytical pieces that are a little bit shorter. Is sort of where we're going a little bit in terms of our analysis, because we can publish really long pieces, but we want to, people tend to take information a little bit more shorter snippets now too. So.
And it sounds like you're open to feedback, and so we could shape.
Oh yes, definitely, yeah.
All right, great, thank you. So along that vein, I'm going to turn back to the two of you. So this question is for Erica. So how does this data build our understanding of intersectionality? So how does race interact with aspects such as gender, class, immigration status, or sexual identity?
I think there is, I think the data really could, it's complicated because as in the example, I think of the census data is self-identified. So it also depends on what level of safety someone has when they're filling out the census, I will want to say. But I think one of the things that I was thinking a lot was when we talk about different people's different identity in terms of race, immigration class, or immigration status, class, and even identity, because I think sometimes having this data that might talk about the experience of someone who, or a community that might not be, there might not be fully represented. You can either validate the experiences that you're experiencing, that someone in your intersection, it's not just me who's experiencing this. There's more folks who are having this particular experience, and then you can validate it. You can quantify those experiences to then do levels of advocacy, and then but it also, we're thinking within even ethnocultural communities or the different groups that we belong, it can also bring issues to light.
Yes.
So for example, and I mean, again, I'm not an expert, but I will say that in the past, and this is not a criticism, but in the past there has been conversations, I think, there might be resistance, let's say, in either a settlement organization or within an ethnocultural community, to say, well, in our community, let's say we don't have pervasive incidents of gender-based violence, for example, and or we might not have seen incidents of gender-based violence experienced by 2 LGBTQ plus members of the community. So that's a very, very important piece of intersection in which there's not a lot of visibility within a community itself, and then within service agencies also. So then grabbing the data to bring some of these intersections could help to say, actually, sorry to tell you, but if we go back to these, numbers of things that have been reported, and there's many things we know in this topic that there's lots of underreporting, there is actually an issue in our community, and maybe this could prove an additional point to folks who may want to change something within the community. And I think that could be helpful in bringing up those conversations tonight, because it's difficult to talk about those things, and sometimes we want to. I agree that lots of people, when they're welcoming, ecological communities take the burden of a lot of the work, but we can also think about what happens when those spaces are not safe for you because you have multiple intersections that might not help you belong to that community. So I think having critical information like that could also encourage us to have more difficult and critical but crucial information that it's often not present on our discussions. And even for organizations, when planning programming, we sometimes may not be thinking of specific communities and say, oh, we don't see issues. I mean, we don't see issues of that we've never seen those issues because we only work with families, or we only work with children, or we only work with men, but it exists. So this could help bring some of those issues in, I think, bring some of those issues to light. Yeah.
Great. And I saw you nodding. Did you want to add anything to that?
You just reminds me, so like our Ethnocultural Council in Manitoba right now, we have a Healthy, Safe, and Volunteer Relationship Project, and our team has actually uncovered through their community consultations exactly what you're saying about that safety within ethnocultural communities cannot be there. Sometimes this is specifically for the 2S LGBTQ community, and just the lack of resources that are out there for that community to seek safety. So, and even when they come to Canada, thinking that Canada will be that safe place for them, and then not finding that, even when they come to settle. So, yeah, I do agree with what you're saying.
It's really challenging. And I think you raised a really important point, because I think often we treat the census as though it is measuring everything about everybody, and that's not necessarily the case. So people have to feel safe enough to respond, and they also need to be a respondent, and so maybe not everybody's being captured. So I wonder, Catherine, if you could comment on that aspect in terms of difficulties around getting responses to certain questions, as well as populations that may not be as reflected in the census.
I mean, definitely when we're talking about the census, it is self-enumerated. So it's going to someone's household in which they can fill out either in their home, but because it's by household, there also could be proxy reporting as well. So someone in your household might be responding of other members within the household, right? So sometimes the person themselves isn't necessarily the respondent to some of those questions. As a whole, for the census, because it's mandatory, we do get a very high response rate to our questions. It's not to say that we don't get some reaction to some of the maybe more sensitive questions around gender, population groups that might not answer the question. Sometimes there's some communities that won't answer the question. And for the 2021 census, there were some Indigenous communities that didn't answer the census. So sometimes those estimates can be lower than expected. But because we've collected the census for such a long period of time, we have this historical comparability, so we can see sort of these changes over time. But we also, as part of our certification process, can see maybe where some of those populations that maybe we're not capturing as much as we would like to. We also do a coverage study that usually comes out later, where they start to look at more specific populations. We tend to look at recent immigrants, non-permanent residents, in terms of are we capturing them? Are they filling out the census to get down to some of those populations? But yes, it's something that's come up in a lot of our conversations around collection of data in terms of if people understand the question, do they find the question sensitive? So, and if so, would they still fill out the census? And we do quite extensive qualitative testing, one-on-one interviews with people. We're actually going to be entering that this summer in terms of going through the census, where people fill it out and they get interviewed with someone one-on-one, so they can tell us what they think about the questions and whether they understand it, and how they feel about the response category. So we get that sort of immediate reaction from people.
Kathleen, one last question for you before we move to the audience questions. And I am going to really encourage folks to please put your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll have some time for you to ask questions or make comments. So Kathleen, how is this data connected with your personal lived experience?
So one of the stats that really stood out for me and actually makes me think, so when it said that 2/3 of more than 58,000 recent immigrants living in Manitoba were admitted under the economic category, my mom was actually the one that got us into Canada. So my mom is an aircraft engineer, and when we came to Canada, it was because they needed females in the aviation field, and they needed female engineers. But when we came to Canada at the time, they weren't ready. They brought us to Canada off of the understanding that my mom would have a job. And then when we came to Canada, they weren't ready for us, or they weren't ready for my mom to enter the work field. So she had to go to Red River, and they told her, get whatever, certificate you can get so you can make money for your family. And she became a healthcare aide for, I think it was 3 years before there were job openings for her. And then ended up getting a job at Air Canada, and that was her livelihood for, until she retired 4 years ago. She was in avionics for 25 years. And I think about that in terms of when we hear that we bring in so many newcomers based off of economic means, and what is our ability to support them when they're here. Do we have those jobs readily available, and do we have the infrastructure in place to ensure that when they come here, they're able to enter that workforce that, they're skilled and knowledgeable in, and able to provide for their families? Because when we first came to Canada, we were on social assistance because my mother couldn't, get into the field that she was able to. And we, and I watched my family struggle and, have to jump through hoops and not know what services were available to us. When we came, my mom, I know specifically my mom and my dad both did it on their own. They navigated the system on their own and through word of mouth. We didn't have close connections to our ethnocultural communities, so it was really difficult for us when we first came. And I was quite young, I was 4, but I could still see as a 4-year-old that those impacts. And so I wonder, with as much as we hear how great these numbers are and how large these numbers are, I think about it in terms of what are our abilities to support them once they are here, and to ensure that they are successful, and not lying to them, I guess. I don't want it to be a lie. So so I think about that in terms of my personal experience.
So that gap between the expectations, the points that people get for having skills and really high demand occupations in Canada, and then they get here, and then there's all sorts of hurdles around your credential recognition in terms of actually being able to enter that field. And sometimes it's impossible, where they get stuck in those survival jobs for the rest of their lives. Which is really tragic. Well, thanks for sharing that. That's tough. Okay. All right. So we're gonna move on to our audience question and answer and comments. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And I'll actually start with the question that Nat asked right at the beginning. I don't know if you want to close it.
Sure. Yes. So I was looking at the census and I thought, who is not being reflected in the data that's in front of us? And for folks who are in precarious living situations, how are they being reflected in this data or not? And how do we reach out to those folks?
And you're talking specifically about people that might be homeless, living on the street,
Yeah.
not necessarily at a household.
Not necessarily at
So just looking at how that's reflected in the census. Yeah. So in the census, it's the census is at your usual place of residence. So capturing that population is very challenging. We are currently in a lot of discussions right now about how we can do this better in terms of capturing that in future censuses. So we know that it's a data gap that we're trying to find a way to fill. So as we move forward for we're already in full on gear for 2026 census, which is crazy since we just released 2021. But we are looking at ways that we can better get at that population for that. So stay tuned for there'll be testing and things that come out from things as we move forward.
Yeah, and for others that might be interested in that same question, and homelessness does a street census, and those results are published. We try and find people where they're at, and gather some.
Yeah. Even if but sometimes we look at the populations too, and sometimes census is one venue that we could do this, but sometimes other ways are doing it. So that's why it's, everything's sort of in different testing modes, and we're looking at different ways to get at this population. But it's definitely one that is on the radar for a lot of areas in terms of a data need. But as of right now, it's not really fully captured in the census as we collect it.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Okay, we have a question, which is from Piper Larson. Thank you all so much for the valuable comments. You guys can all pat yourself on the back. Questions and data presented. I have found in research I have been doing for my master's, there's an ability to dehumanize communities and people through data. How do we ensure that communities are not only seen as numbers and quotas? So who wants to tackle that first?
I could try. I think numbers are important. They tell one piece of the story, but I think when combined with what it actually means, like the human story behind the numbers, and I think often there's many ways to do it. I mean, in research, there's different qualitative methods of how to bring the voices of communities like that. But I think also to have examples of what does that really means for someone's story. What does that mean when people have trouble getting their credentials recognized, and for most of their life, like they were a doctor and now they're going to be a taxi driver for 25 years. So what is the impact in the family, in the history of that relationship, if they had a relationship? I think telling those stories, I think there is a role in which communities can play a role to bring those, transform the data into the stories of actual people and what the ripple effect that is in the communities, that we can bring it to organizations, to policymakers, to politicians. I think that's one way of humanizing it. And I think maybe having more space where people can be critical about how the data reflects or doesn't reflect, and communities can say with their own voices how they feel reflected or not reflected in some of this information. But yeah, and I mean, data can be used for politicians who are anti-immigration and say we're bringing too many people, and look, we've already done all of that. But we have to then be prepared to have an answer to come back to those groups. And I think, there's different ways that it could be done to actually humanize the stories, because in the end, it's not about numbers, it's about people and sense of belonging in a community and what the sense of belonging means. And I think is important. I don't know if I answered it.
No, I think you did, like in terms of really emphasizing the importance of more qualitative research, using storytelling as a really powerful way of communication, and having people actively engaged and participating in that process of shaping their own stories, so that they're not just subjects, like they're part of the research process in a really integral way. Did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think that there's a shift actually in the way that we are conducting research, like especially community-based research lately, where it is community members that are involved have that sense of ownership from beginning to end, and they are able to identify the way in which their story or their information is used and how it is disseminated in that project. So I think using practices that are coming up, such as story catching, I know PW is using that in some of the research that we're doing around community safety, is using the story catching method, and using those practices as opposed to methods that have been used in the past that can be extremely, like Piper said, dehumanizing. I think allowing community to really have a voice and say in the way that their information is being used is extremely encouraging.
Piper says you certainly did answer, Erica. Thank you! Exclamation mark. And Catherine, I don't know if you want to weigh in at all. Is this something that Stats Canada grapples with at all, or?
We try to look at the ways that we present the data, that we're doing it in a way that is respectful and reflective of different diverse groups and situations, and in the way that we provide it. Obviously, data is what we do, but we are mindful in the way that we present that, and even when we're presenting information on a specific population, that there are many different lived experiences even within each of those populations, that it's all very diverse, and we're really trying to do that in the way that we present our data now, in terms of not putting everything into one group, that it's not just the immigrant population, but that you're looking at that immigration population by different racialized groups, and then looking at that racialized groups based on where people are born, and understanding that it's all of these different groups have different experiences. So I think what you both described there in terms of like bringing those communities in to help with how that gets disseminated, and moving more towards storytelling and bringing in these lived experiences, I think it all ties it in together.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. I know Sid, you had possibly a question.
Yeah, I'm. Am I out of the picture?
You know you're there. You're there. You don't have to. We all know everything.
I'm interested in what what income data are available by immigration group, by ethnic group, average income data, poverty rates, and so on, and in Stats Canada's plans to disseminate that kind of information.
Well, currently right now there is income data on the website that is crossed by different population groups. So there's low income, there's market basket measure, there's various economic categories, such as like it has like a average income, total income. I can put it in the chat so you can see the full suite of variables that are variable. And then also like some of the tables that are there, but some of it's already been released, and then we continue to release more and more data over the coming year. But there's already quite a bit of data already available. And there was an article that was put out around October too on market basket measure by various groups as well.
Are there plans to? I agree there are a lot of data. Are there plans that more accessible to cultural communities?
In terms of the way it's presented, or in just that it being accessible online, in the way that it currently is in like a table or.
Yes, so I'm wondering about different modes of presenting that don't require either viewing a large table or manipulating a large table.
Mm. I do know that there are some plans to do some more like profile style tables, which you can, select a group and then it shows you all of their characteristics. So I know that they'll be doing some by low income and looking at low income and then the various characteristics by that, which is an easier way to sort of grab onto that information as opposed to like a cross tabulation, which is a lot of things crossed together, which is a lot for people to digest. And then usually they'll put out more like analytical pieces that will come out later as well.
Thanks.
Do you have any other questions from the audience? Probably have space for about 2 or 3 more questions. If there's anyone in the audience that has any questions or comments. As long as the speeches are relatively short.
I have a question to ask. I
Oh,
have
absolutely.
From behind here. I'm really interested in Stats Canada and your engagement context. As you continue to talk about engaging community, and I think the question is, how are you doing that? If it's just simply online, is that enough?
It's a good. Sorry, did you have more to add?
No. No.
Okay. We do different types of engagement. So some of it is online where someone can click online and provide their feedback in sort of like a questionnaire format. Currently, right now, we are in public consultations around the racialized groups, what is also called the visible minority standard that we have at Statistics Canada, which is derived based on the Employment Equity Act in terms of how that both around the terminology, how that is disseminated. So with that, there are different focus groups in which we do that engagement. So we do different types of groups. We do focus groups with federal partners. We do that with some of our academics, and then we also work with community groups as well. So we're moving into a phase where we're working more with community groups in terms of how we're presenting and disseminating that information. And then once all that engagement is completed, we will publish a report on what we heard. So I can certainly share that in the chat, because if any of you are interested in providing any feedback on how that data is disseminated, we would love to hear from the community groups. And then we also engage in terms of how we disseminate information. So this one's more on like the visible minority standards specifically, just because around the terminology, we're in transition, whether we should use, racialized groups, whether we should use visible minority population groups, it's still in flux, and we want to hear from everyone in terms of the best way to present that information, because as Statistics Canada, we need to provide a standard or like a way to provide that information. And we do try to use similar terminology across different federal departments or provinces, so that people know that we're talking about the same thing. So that's why we come up with these standards. So we want to hear from that. And then we are also doing engagement in terms of how we collect the information. So do people understand the population group question itself? So there's a lot of different ways, and those are one-on-one interviews that we do for that type of engagement. So we do have 2 engagements going on the website, and I can put those links in the chat. And we'd love to hear from any of you that would like to participate. And then as we move forward, as we continue, like we're always available to, you can contact Statistics Canada. We have an InfoStats line that you can also write an email, and they will send it to the right subject matter experts in terms of providing us your feedback, and then we can reach out to you and get more information.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so we're gonna move on to the next phase, which is to invite all of the panelists to add their reflections and any additional comments that they would like to make. So I am going to start by picking on Catherine first.
I think that this was honestly, thank you to CMCCF for providing this opportunity to listen and to learn. I think that I was able to learn a lot today, and thank you, Catherine, for presenting. I think that this, again, is valuable information that we would be able to take back to our organizations and our networks and community, and work with it to, again, I think our access to data is always something that we say we need. So being able to have up-to-date data, even though now it is 2023, and it's great to hear that you're already talking about 2026 and, the importance of it. So I am very grateful to be able to have this data, to be able to use it, and to be able to share it with those that I work with and the communities that I'm able to work with. So yeah, thank you for this opportunity to get to reflect on it.
I'm going to ask a follow-up.
Oh, geez.
Do you have any reflections on sort of both sides of the equation? One is the role that community organizations can play in terms of translating this data, how to make it more accessible for community. And then secondly, it seems like there's an open invitation with Stats Canada to provide input in terms of what kind of data we'd like to see, how we'd like it presented. So what ideas are percolating for you in relation to those two dimensions?
So I will say that when Catherine was just doing her last bit, that I'm so glad that the conversation around visible minority that we're having that conversation, that you are looking into changing that. I know that within the work that we're doing currently across the board, that we're hearing from community members that is an outdated term, that they do not want to be reflected in any way using that term. So to know that you are looking into that and that there is a consideration to have that changed, because I think it is important. I think if you want people to participate in these surveys, you want people to reflect on their identity in these surveys, they have to see themselves reflected in that terminology. And I think if you don't, then the accuracy, I think, maybe of what you're going to present, or the willingness of people to want to participate in that will be less, decreased. So I do appreciate that there is a willingness to listen to what community has to say, and I think changing again something like that, like the terminology of this minority, is something that's so important to community right now. So hearing that's a willingness, that's something that I would encourage community members or people that I work with to get onto the, your survey that they're asking, and to participate in that so that they can have their voices heard in that.
And Catherine just put the link in the chat for in terms of the consultative engagement. So that's great.
Right. Erica, what are your comments or thoughts?
I think connecting to engagement, I think there is definitely roles we could play to sort of within other agencies, to sort of, when we have certain conversations, to encourage people to participate on how this information can be disseminated, to have maybe new ideas of how this could be done in community in a way that could be more accessible and inclusive. And that's maybe a role we could play with, bring that back and make people aware that this is happening, and mobilize folks around that. The other piece that I was thinking is that, as Stats Canada, you're working with all this great information, and as you're able to look at different issues or realities over time, it'll be great, when we've been talking about intersections, if we had more data around experiences of racism or or Islamophobia that sometimes is so hard to quantify. And then when you want change in policy or in how communities are done, it's difficult to if we have isolated incidents, it doesn't really bring a strong word for policy change. So having that type of like keeping that in the radar, which I'm sure you folks are doing, but I think that's one area that I kept thinking about, and where we can have some of those different intersections play, and if having that accessible for that can help communities make some of the cases of things that they might see in the day-to-day stronger. Yeah, so that's another thought I had. And yeah, I don't know. Lots of reflection, I think, and learning, as Kathleen had said, and I think it's important also, like I've been doing the exercise of, as I see it, is like what pieces of this is telling part of my story. So I think that has been a good thing that I take to reflect with myself, and to think about how does that connect with who I am and other folks of my community, and even my sense of identity or belonging after my certain amount of time of being here.
Yeah, I didn't ask you that question about how this data connects to your personal experience. So we have some time.
Oh well, no, I'm just saying necessarily. I was just like bringing that reflection, because I think that's when we're talking about humanizing data. Like that's probably important. Like you know how we came. You know, in my it's interesting to see that in Manitoba, the family reunification category, it's small in comparison to the economic migrant, and that's how I, in my way, how I immigrated. It was through that category, and thinking about, what does that meant? Because I didn't know, I was not close with my community, ethnocultural community. I had no idea about settlement services. So I never knew about it since like way later in life. So it's very interesting to see like my own experience, and the one that it talks about women, immigrant women in the workplace, and how much harder is it to be in the workplace when you have younger children, and how that makes you more relevant to potentially leave unemployment. I was employed at one point, and when I had my first child, due to issues with childcare and not having a large community or support network, I left my employment. That it was secure full time, and I was very happy in it. Like I felt very appreciated and everything. But I left it because the pressure on all those other intersections were so much, and I had such inconsistent childcare and not a network around me, that I just was unemployed for 6 months. I just quit one day, and that was like, but it seemed that I reflected as like, oh look, I'm an immigrant woman who exploited this, and then had this employment and education, but still this is just reflecting my story. So that was interesting to think about.
So you saw yourself in that data.
Yeah. So lots to learn, and I think good conversation after this.
Thanks so much for sharing that. Yeah, and Catherine, I'm going to put you on the spot as well in terms of your final thoughts and reflections.
I just, want to say thank you for allowing us Saskia to come and participate. It's been interesting to hear how the data is being used, and ways that we could potentially do better to present the data. I think what I heard a little bit was just that a way to make this data a little bit more digestible and tangible and accessible for the community and those that are using the data. So I'm going to take that back to my colleagues at StatsCan and say this is what I've heard from where I am. But I found the conversation very interesting, and I really love hearing how our data is being used. And so thank you for allowing me to come and participate and share the data that we have.
Well, thank you for your willingness to be part of this and to allow us to put you on the spot and ask you lots of that weren't necessarily on the list. But I wonder if it's
no problem.
StatsCan might even adopt a storytelling approach where you might have the infographics, data, the story that humanizes it. Anyways, just a Okay, so we're gonna move to the next part, which is the last word. So I'd like to invite Sanjana to share her reflections on what she's heard this evening. Sanjam is a first-generation Punjabi settler living on Treaty 1 territory. She graduated from the University of Winnipeg in 2021 with a BA in Conflict Resolution Studies and Political Science. Sanjam is dedicated to advocating for conditions that foster inclusivity and equity and forging transformative solutions to multidimensional conflicts. She's a co-founder of the Collective of Voices, and is actively involved in the community on topics of reconciliation and allyship. She also has experience working in political settings, having worked at a senator's office, minister's regional offices, and Manitoba Legislative Assembly. I think you can be a great help with this around advocacy. Hoping to pursue a career in law, Sanjam is currently a senior research assistant for the University of Winnipeg and completing the law school admissions process.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Louise. I'd like to thank everyone for their words today. So it's quite difficult to sum everything up. I have a lot going on in my head, but I'd like to sort of touch on the topic of dissemination of information. And so currently I work with elected officials and in the area of policy development. And so communication is very, very important for us, for the MLAs or officials across the country or across our province. And so what we've noticed is that cultural communities really trust their ethnic sources of media because it connects topical events here, but also events from the country they've immigrated from. And so they can sort of get both sides at once, and that's where they digest a lot of their information. And I think StatsCan could really have a great partnership with different ethnic media outlets to sort of disseminate this information. That was my first thought. And then sort of touching on the topic of political will and the importance of data. So elected officials meet folks from all walks of life. But in order to generate that sort of political will, the first question they often ask their policy development team is, well, what does the data tell us? What should we pursue? Who are we serving and why do we need to serve that community? What do they need? And I think StatsCan does a great job at sort of reflecting that data, and I use a lot of the data in my day-to-day policy work. And so, I mean, everyone says the census is a statistical portrait. That's exactly what it is, and that's the sort of information elected officials and those in decision-making chairs, seats, tables, that's what they used to funnel in hundreds of billions of dollars at the federal, provincial, and municipal level. And so what does this data mean for cultural communities is, where does that money get put in? What services does it get put into? And so when folks are looking and seeing that, oh, we have, for example, what was this stat here? 14.2% folks speaking Punjabi at home. This translates into Punjabi English bilingual programs in different school divisions across our city. And that's where, for example, superintendents will choose to put resources to work so that students can remain connected to sort of both languages, because that's what families and communities need. And so this data is so important. I almost think of the census as a channel of communication because a lot of people understand numbers. It's hard to come across every single person and hear about their lived experiences, their positionality, their intersectionality. And it's a lot easier to sort of digest that in numbers, and especially when it comes to policy development. And so that's where I think the census plays a great role in connecting community to Parliament, the legislature, City Hall, that sort of bridge that needs to be made. I think the census sort of builds that bridge very well. And but yes, the topic of dehumanization in numbers, it's very, very real. It's very easy to read. Oh, well, maybe only 4% of this community resides in my constituency. They're not the majority. And that's where outreach plays a role in politics, where folks are able to meet and face to face and hear folks, their immigration, their struggle, settlement. And I think we're noticing a lot of that. We talk a lot about labor shortage needs. And so immigrants are sort of seen as a band-aid to that solution, and not enough resources are being funneled into settlement services. Yes, we have labor shortage needs, but so many folks who are immigrating here are not settling because, first of all, they don't really have connections here. They're not able to access settlement agencies. And so they're not able to establish their roots here. And so when we talk about immigration, labor shortage needs, we also need to talk about settlement, sort of bridging that rural-urban divide, because a lot of the labor shortage is not in cities like Winnipeg, for example. It's in Winkler, it's in Morden, and a lot of ethnic communities don't have established roots there. And when we talk about cultural communities picking up the slack, if there are no established cultural communities in those areas, how can we sort of diversify those parts of our province and like the concentrations that are built, but sort of establish a diverse population or demographic across the country, not just in sort of concentrated bubbles. So that's another thing I was thinking about. And so when I think of the role of census for cultural communities, it's in 3 areas. One would be in generating political will. And I think it's important to remember that as immigration levels increase, politicians are sort of slowly stepping away from the voter-centric mindset, because they're realizing that a lot of their community aren't necessarily Canadian citizens. They are international students. There are folks with work permits. There are permanent residents. And it's not just about serving your voters. It's really about serving your community. And I think we're seeing a lot of that as constituencies grow to be more diverse. So that's quite important. And I know what the work that we're doing is sometimes a lot of folks who immigrate here believe that because they aren't citizens, they cannot access government services or government offices, but elected officials are there for every single person, regardless of citizenship status. And so I think that's also very important. So when it comes to generating political will, the census is extremely important, but also research and academia. Academia informs a lot of decision-making and policy-making as well. And I think that's one area where the census perhaps inadvertently fuels research for either professors or in the form of grants or different communities, community-based research as well. And then also planning for community at both the municipal, provincial, and federal level. The census plays a great role in the topic of healthcare or education in our province. Those are the areas of life that touch our life every day to day. It's not so much international affairs, but it's waste and water services, road repairs, healthcare, education. And then when we talk about the census as a whole, I think it plays a very important part in planning for our communities. But I think when we talk about data, there is room and a conversation to be had about collecting disaggregated data at the provincial level, because we get the census or it's published every, correct me if I'm wrong, Catherine, 4 to 7 years. I might be wrong, but I know that's quite a while.
It's every 5.
Well, you were in the middle. You were in the
You're good. You're good.
a lot changes in 5 years, and I think the pandemic really showed us that a lot can change in just a few years. And so when we are planning, when we are establishing budgets at every order of government, there's a role for collecting data and publishing data even at our provincial level. And I think we saw that with COVID when we started collecting race-based data in healthcare. And that really informed our vaccine rollout. And Manitoba had one of the strongest vaccine rollouts in the country, and we were the first province to begin collecting that race-based data. And I think that can be done for all provincial and municipal services, so we can see who's accessing them, who isn't accessing them, and which communities should be accessing them. And I think that disaggregated data federally is great, but definitely there needs to be a role in municipal and provincial areas of services too, because having that published yearly is really beneficial for when we are planning, because waiting 5 years is a long time. And with immigration levels at an all-time high, as we talk about labor shortages and all of that, in 5 years, Canada will look very different. And I'm sure we'll notice that in our own close-knit communities as well. Yes. Let me just quickly check if I have anything else left. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Okay. The one last thing I'll sort of touch on is just noticing. I work a lot with liaising between educators and elected officials, and so just in the way that educators are using language, or how the curriculum is developing, or what classrooms are looking like, how the student makeup is looking like, it's so different from just 5 years ago. It's so different, and now so many bilingual programs are being offered at schools because they're noticing there's a need to serve cultural communities as well. And that sort of francophone heavy mindset is not so prevalent in schools anymore as it once was. The sort of bilingual English, French is not so present. And I think that that's what I really took away from the presentation when we talked about changes in that sort of linguistic landscape. And of course, I've been hearing from educators, parents, unseen families, students, but when I read that in the census, that really summarized everything for me, and it was very tangible. So when it comes to developing policy in curriculum, in language, in sort of pitching, even at the federal level, the importance of having various languages funded at that level, so resources are translated. I think we can directly see that from the census, and that serves as a stepping stone towards change. So ultimately, for me, it's a stepping stone, and it's an effective channel of communication, especially for lawmakers. That's how I would summarize.
Oh, that's amazing. That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head in a number of different areas, and particularly with your last comment, you can't change what you don't measure. And so really putting a really fine point on the importance of this data for planning, for resource allocation, for advocacy, and even in terms of people exercising sort of their civic rights, connecting with their political representatives. And I also like how you also pointed to the need for other data beyond the census, both in terms of timeliness and also in terms of disaggregation and getting a really good picture of the data that we need in order to actually do all of those things, particularly resource allocation in an effective way. And I really like the points that you made about how this data is such a key driver in decision making, and I think that's something that we should all be paying attention to. So thank you all very much. So I'd like to Thanks, Sandra, Catherine, Erica, and Kathleen for taking the time to do this, for your very thoughtful presentations and comments, but also to the folks behind the scenes, the Coalition of Manitoba Cultural Communities for Families, who did all of the hard work of getting this organized, as well as the next panel discussion. So just wanted to remind you that the next panel discussion will be on March 21st, and that one is on family diversity. So it's certainly building on a lot of what we talked about here today, but it's an important discussion in terms of looking at the framework and thinking about cultural communities and how we strengthen families. So registration remains open, so please see the CMCCF website at cmccfamilies.ca for registrations. I'll repeat that again. It's cmccfamilies.ca for registration. We're also going to be providing you with an evaluation of tonight's panel, so that'll be sent out to everyone that was part of this very soon. Please do respond. Your ideas do matter to us. Very interested in hearing from you so that it can help shape future opportunities for engagement and discussions. Just wanted to thank everybody involved, and also thank all of you who are participating from Manitoba, other parts of Canada, and even India. So this is, yeah. And I'm new to this whole hybrid thing, but it is really neat to be able to have a discussion of this sort where the presenters aren't all in one space and neither is the audience. So thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you at the next panel.
Technology has come such a far way, and it has contributed to such a good discussion tonight. There were so many highlights, and the discussion shows how incredibly important the census is. So at this point in time, CMCCF is excited. We're looking forward to working more with Statistics Canada to look at more data and also how to better serve the new Canadian population with data-driven information. And that is in alignment with our goals of healthy families, healthy communities. So we are really and truly excited. And none of this would have been possible without our panelists. And Louise, you did such an incredible job. Thank you so much. Thank you to Kathleen, to Erica, to Sanjam. We also thank Catherine for joining us, our funders, our audience. Tonight was truly a good session, and I hope you all leave feeling empowered, fulfilled, and just driven to do some more work, right? And as Louise pointed out, we'll be sending out the feedback, so please do send your feedback in, because that helps us to improve what we're doing, but also to better serve the community we're trying to reach. Also, March 21st, please mark your calendar. Louise pointed out that you can check out our website for more information there, so we'd love to see the media faces on the 21st. So with that said, I'd like to thank you all. Also, Meharit, I won't forget you. You did such an incredible job with the chat. So thank you all. And from CMCCF to all of you, thanks.